Earlier this year, I was approached to give a talk at something called the Decades Project in Dallas. It was an event honoring the trailblazing women in B2B sales with a focus on the 1980s. Lori Richardson, who has quickly moved up the list to one of my favorite people on the planet, was the driver of the event, and she had called me months earlier asking if I'd speak. I not only said yes, but the talk took residence in my brain every day following that conversation. How would I best honor this group and their purpose? I gave a talk starting with the trailblazing women in sales in the 80s, but not the 1980s. I went back to the 1880s. I wasn't paid to give it. I wrote it from scratch only for this event. I only had around 15 minutes to present it. I may never give it again, and it was quite possibly the most rewarding one I've ever given. I couldn't let that be it, so today I'm bringing that portion of the talk with many more additional details to you. Let's talk about what it was like to be a woman selling in the 1800s.
Welcome to the Sales History Podcast, the show that uncovers the forgotten stories, ideas, pioneers, and moments that shaped the sales profession and what they can teach us about selling, leading, and earning trust today. Here's your host, three-time award-winning author, certified speaking professional keynote speaker, go-to-market sales trainer, and sales nerd, Todd Caponi.
So often, many seem to think that women in the sales profession really began in the 1980s, and I guess maybe even I thought that way. In many cases, a lot of people I talk to think that sales started in the 1980s. But as I've been reading and doing all this research and all my nerdery around sales history, I've discovered individuals like even Carol Burnett. You remember the famous comedic actress? She was advocating for women in sales in the 1960s. I got her on the cover of a Salesman's Opportunity magazine from that year. Myra Noble, who was the editor for Women's Opportunity magazine in the 1950s, spent her time educating women on the opportunities for women in sales. All the way back to 1916, there was individuals like Catherine Blackford who were teaching the phrenology sales methodology at the 1916 World Sales Congress. And of course, the woman I did an entire podcast episode on, the individual I feel is the pioneer for teaching women in sales, Lucinda W. Prince, from 1905 through the 1920s, is an individual that obviously started things much earlier than the 1980s. I also did a podcast episode on Barbara Pletcher, who was the unsung trailblazer for women in sales in the 1980s, and spoke of her at the Dallas event. It started a process to try to get a hold of her, and as of this moment, I don't believe anybody has heard anything yet, but she's still around. You possibly heard about individuals like Madam C.J. Walker, where you'll find a whole mini-series on Netflix, but we're going to go even further back. Today, anyway, I'm here to tell you that women in sales goes back to at least the Civil War in the 1860s. So let's talk about some of the stories of the early pioneering women in the sales profession and what it was like to be a woman carrying a bag, literally. For much of the history of the United States, a large percentage of the country's inhabitants lived in areas with few opportunities to learn about or acquire new things. If you didn't live in a city, there was no TV advertisements, of course, or internet pop-ups, no email marketing. You were essentially isolated from what was available and what was even possible. Now, on the other hand, if you had something to sell, the core way was to put up advertisements to hire individuals to take your products into the heartland of America. You were looking for what were called commercial travelers, or worse, names like peddlers, bagmen, or drummers. But in the latter half of the 1800s, the more respectable people in this class were referred to as commercial travelers. Now, imagine for a moment what it was like to be a commercial traveler at the time. It's the fall. You're traveling, obviously, without a phone, without GPS. You're trying to hit one more town before finding a place to find shelter, a meal, and maybe a place to sleep. A storm rolls in, chock full of wind and rain. There was no weather app to warn you. You're in the middle of nowhere. What do? Well, in many cases, you might find a farm or a cabin, knock on the door, and see if they're willing to take you in for the night. You might sleep in a room with the farmers, eating whatever fresh off the cow or pig meal they'd be whipping up. And if they made coffee for you, you could count on the cream coming right from the udder moments earlier. One important area of work for commercial travelers was bringing literacy to rural America. So book canvassing was a huge thing. The combination of a growing population, increasing literacy rates, and improved transportation meant more books could be produced faster and more cheaply. So things like Bibles, farming manuals, books on health and domestic life, along with fiction, histories, a desire for self-improvement and entertainment, those were all in demand. And for many, just having lots of books was considered a status symbol. In that latter half of the 1800s, the number of women entering the workforce overall increased. According to the 1870 census, which was the first time the number of female employees in the country was measured, women made up around 15% of the workforce. That continued to grow to 20% in 1900 and 24% by 1910. There were employment guides like Rain's What a Woman Can Do, and George G. Manson wrote Work for Women in 1883. Both guides discussed book canvassing as a profession. Now, most of these commercial travelers were men. According to the 1880 census, there were, quote, 53,500 hucksters and peddlers. And that's language according to Walter A. Friedman's book, Birth of a Salesman. I think it was probably 25 years ago. He wrote that of those 53,500 hucksters and peddlers, 51,000 were male and 2,500 were female. Many of these women were book agents, so upwards of probably 2,000 women were doing this book traveling, canvassing type work at the time. The role was considered physically and emotionally demanding, given that you had to carry heavy books as samples for long hours in all sorts of environments, including dirt roads and random weather. And just like today, prospects were sometimes unreceptive and often hostile. Women faced additional challenges, from enduring sexism to the potential dangers of traveling alone. At the time, more publishers were recruiting women travelers, highlighting the opportunities to travel, experience adventure, make a bunch of money. While that wasn't always true, selling books made more money than many other potential jobs at the time. Now, I managed to track down pieces of the books that a couple of these women commercial travelers wrote themselves about their experiences selling books during the time. Annie Nels Dumond wrote one in 1868 called Annie Nels, or The Life of a Book Agent. This one starts kind of crazy. Dumond was born in 1837, grew up in luxury in Atlanta, Georgia. Her father died, and her mother then married a man who was neglectful to her, compelling her to marry early. She did, writing, quote,
"Thus it was settled that I was to become his wife, to give up my freedom, my individuality, my all into his keeping."
Turns out this was a man who already had a wife and children. After leaving him, she got remarried and was abandoned. She tried multiple jobs to make ends meet, including being a painting instructor. In one case, she was offered a sewing position, but she declined because of the pay. She wrote that she asked the manager, "How do you expect me to earn a living at those prices?" But then she saw an advertisement for book canvassing. I tell this story for a couple of reasons. First, at the time, women often entered the sales profession due to hardship. Many women, especially those with her background, had very little education, which made it difficult to find a conventional job. Being in sales allowed her to support herself and avoid poverty, which very few other options could. She was able to pick up the business acumen required very quickly, too. Second, the societal perception drove her to travel wearing a mourning bonnet, giving the impression that she was a widow.
It was not altogether right, but no one was injured thereby, and it seemed to me to be almost necessary to my self-preservation that my past should not be known.
In 1874, Mrs. J.W. Likens wrote a book called 6 Years' Experience as a Book Agent in California. Her writing took on much more about the sexism she encountered. She tells of her husband that was in poor health and unable to work. They lived in San Francisco, where she happened to see a sign recruiting canvassers. She accepted a position, but soon found men reprimanding her on the streets about how she should be at home and, quote, not strolling around in this kind of manner. Others assumed she was also a suffragist, which was one of the many people campaigning for the right for women to vote at the time. One shop owner yelled at her,
"You damn women think you will rule the country."
The book I really dug into was a book called Facts by a Woman. It was written anonymously, but turns out it was by Harriet Wasser Steyer in 1881. She writes about being a miserable dependent, and one day saw a newspaper ad recruiting agents to sell Mark Twain's book, Tom Sawyer. Now, her book starts with a story of her being at an affluent women's home for a party. They weren't aware that Harriet had started canvassing and started ripping on women salespeople.
Any woman having a particle of good moral breeding would never resort to such a conspicuous mode of gaining a livelihood.
Before she could reply, the party's guest of honor chimed in, defending the position. That guest of honor was a well-respected, wealthy woman who revealed that she had been a book canvasser in her youth. The point here is that women's role in sales was viewed poorly by both men and women at the time. There was a narrow-minded stereotype about it. During a train ride, while having a conversation with another woman who was being really friendly, upon learning of her profession, changed her demeanor, got up, and found another seat, quote, free from contamination. Steyer tells another story which ends with a man telling her that if she were his sister, he would sooner murder her than let her sell as a traveling canvasser. She traveled through difficult terrain, lumber camps, prospecting settlements, and mining towns. She stayed in bed-bug-ridden places, ate horrific food, rode in dirty stagecoaches, and had to carry around books. In one small-town hotel, she was told not to stay as there were no ladies in the building and, quote, some of the men were very rough. In the 1890 edition of How 'Tis Done, a thorough ventilation of the numerous schemes conducted by wandering canvassers, there's a chapter dedicated to the tactics used by book canvassers. In it, the author warns the men to beware of the female book canvassers, talking about how the woman will likely seduce them into buying expensive, unwanted books.
The masculine victim will be wheedled into buying anything, from an almanac to a family Bible in 52 parts, if the girl be pretty and have a winning smile.
As I read these memoirs from the women travelers, they talked about how they almost had to convince themselves that they were doing a good deed through their work. Dumond wrote in her 1869 book,
I have since learned to believe that no occupation which tends so directly and so powerfully to the dissemination of light and knowledge among the masses as does the book agency can be called useless, degrading, or disreputable.
In Likens' 1874 book, she had a differing opinion. She wrote that she, quote, knew it was an honorable and legitimate business, but, quote, still it seemed to me very much like begging. In all of the cases, the women writers spoke about being the only woman traveler on a train car, going into male-dominated areas, and the need to not be afraid. And yes, sometimes they used their gender for an advantage, like Steyer writing, quote,
Surely you will not refuse to buy a little book from the only woman that ever visited you here, coming so far and alone into this forest of trees and men, just to give you an opportunity to purchase the most popular books published.
So there you have it. Women have been selling successfully since at least the 1800s. Back then, many things were coming together, like the perception of books as a status symbol and more women entering the workforce. Sales for women was seen as an opportunity to make good money, gain freedom, and enjoy flexibility. But it was grueling, physically, mentally, and even emotionally. This episode took a lot of research. I found versions online of these books, but I wanted to call out Jolie Brown's work called There Is No Respectable Woman That Sells Books, which was a summary for the Society of Textual Scholarship as a big help. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, the stories, and have a greater appreciation for those who have come way before us. If you have one more sec, give the podcast a rating and or a review wherever you listened. And if you think it's worth others listening to, share it. That keeps me going. So until next time, thank you again for listening.